It's really important to see that, because it's easy enough to talk about floods and cataclysms, but actually to see its effect on the landscape directly it has an emotional impact.
Our planet, as we know it, is one truly strange place. Not many are necessarily comfortable admitting it, but the truth is that there's much more to this earthly plane than we're willing to admit, and for many who've looked into it, the truth definitely is out there. Over the years, scientists and experts in different fields have given their lives toward finding the truth about our world and its secrets. These men and women have dedicated their lives and resources towards uncovering more mysteries about events that took place long before any of us were born, with a view of understanding the histories of our world and any possible secrets it might hold. Graham Hancock is one such man. With decades worth of experience, this historian and researcher has helped to uncover several interesting facts about our world, facts that many don't know, albeit by design. And even though he's faced considerable backlash for it, he continues to shed light on these secrets to help enlighten us. Recently, Graham began uncovering a new mystery, one surrounding the Grand Canyon and what could possibly lie in it. Join us in this video as we examine the new facts that Graham has pointed out, as well as the implications they might have for us as a species. Graham Hancock, explorer, researcher, outlier. If you're interested in the sciences and humanities, there's a possibility that you've heard about Graham Hancock, and if you haven't, well, that could also be by design. For years, he and several of his fellow researchers have faced considerable pushback for their views, with many in the mainstream scientific community calling their work pseudoscience. However, recent findings have begun to corroborate many of his findings, leading to more exposure as Graham now sees higher levels of credibility. So, who really is Graham? Born in Edinburgh, Scotland back in 1950, Graham is a man with a truly extensive resume. He began his educational adventure with a degree in sociology at England's prestigious Durham University, after which he ventured into a career in journalism. Graham's journalistic work saw him work with several top news stations and magazines, including The Times, The Independent, and The Guardian. He had a primary focus on international conflicts, and he ventured into several conflict-ridden regions, including Ethiopia and Rwanda, and at the same time he recorded several of his experiences and published them in books, with titles including 1989's Lords of Poverty and 1992's The Sign and the Seal. Despite a thriving career in journalism, however, Graham soon found himself drawn to the more mysterious parts of our world. Some believe that he was influenced by the stories of ancient ruins he had heard while visiting some ancient cities, but as Graham himself has said, he was also interested in history and anthropology. Soon enough, Graham began exploring his fascination with the unknown. Particularly, he looked to find connections between various archaeological, historical, and cross-cultural phenomena. He loved questioning conventional knowledge, and with a penchant for radical theories, he soon found his calling, exploring the secrets of our universe by making daring ventures in areas where many experts didn't want to go. Much of Graham's work has revolved around the belief that we can better understand our world by looking at its past, and by extension, have a clue of where our civilization is headed. And over time, he has posited that there have been advanced civilizations that ruled our world, but which eventually got lost due to some cataclysmic event or the other. Through several of his books, including 1995's Fingerprints of the Gods and 2015's Magicians of the Gods, the researcher has spun several narratives and theories, hoping to help us better understand our world and its many secrets. These books present a version of global history that's much different from what we're used to, one in which our world, as we know it, has been through several civilizations that were dominant and expansive. However, due to some world-ending event or the other, these civilizations, along with their technology, ancient texts, and other pieces of evidence that point to their existence, were lost to history. Graham also espouses a theory that many of the myths we've been told might not necessarily have been myths at all. Instead, he believes that they're stories of events that actually happened, albeit with a modification or two. And by following these myths, we can better understand the events they describe and find the truth about the origins of our planet. As you would imagine, many of Graham's theories have been incredibly controversial. Many in the mainstream scientific community have accused him and his colleagues of promoting pseudoscience, and some have even called for him to be excommunicated. Nevertheless, Graham's work continues to resonate with millions around the world, many of whom share his beliefs that the world is much stranger than it seems, as well as the fact that governments and the elites seem to be keeping a lot of secrets from us. It also helps that some of his theories about the origins of our world have been validated, and according to many of his fans, the fact that some of his work has been verified as credible means that we shouldn't necessarily overlook the others. The Grand Canyon's origins. As a person constantly looking to challenge the conventional knowledge of the world, Graham is always on the lookout for questions that need answers, and recently, he appeared to have gotten a newfound fascination with the Grand Canyon. One of the most iconic landmarks in the United States, the Grand Canyon has always been a subject of curiosity for many. Sure, we all know how large it is and how it makes us feel so tiny, but besides that, there have been many who have looked to understand how the canyon even came to be, as well as possible activities that could have shaped its current form. The Grand Canyon as we know it is a monstrous sight that has evolved over time. Much of its 277-mile-long and 18-mile-wide body have been shaped by the Colorado River, which has continued to carve it for decades now. And as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the canyon continues to draw the wonder of many. No one really knows when the Grand Canyon was discovered. That being said, it has also served as a home for many civilizations and settlers, from the Native Americans known as the ancestral Pueblones to the Kohinana and the Sinagua. The Europeans eventually arrived on the scene sometime in the 15th century, and by the 18th century, American expansion covered the region as well. That said, some have posited that the earliest signs of human habitation in the Grand Canyon date as far back as 12,000 years ago, when Paleo-Indians most likely found a home here. In general, the base of the Grand Canyon contains ancient rocks that have undergone wear and tear for at least a few million years. Above this layer, you find different layers of sedimentary rocks that were shaped by rivers and other forces of nature. Researchers have been fascinated by this stark difference in layering for a long time, so much so that they even named it the Great Unconformity. So far, scientists have been looking to find more information about the Great Unconformity, as they believe it could shed more light on the history of the Grand Canyon and how it came to be. However, a few genius minds like Graham believe they might have cracked the code. According to Graham, the sharp contrast that we see in the underground structure of the Grand Canyon must have been caused by a massive extinction-level flood event. He believes that the flood must have caused the shredding of the ancient layer, then added new layers of sedimentary rocks to create the Great Unconformity. At the same time, the massive erosion from such a flood would most likely have led to the disappearance of rock remains and survivors from that era. When you think about it, Graham's theory isn't necessarily far-fetched. Experts and historians have always referenced cataclysmic floods as part of the history of the world, with the most notable of these being the Bible itself. If you remember the story of Noah very well, it's said that God hit the reset button on the entire planet, washing it all away with a massive flood that basically wiped the entire world clean. Only Noah and his family, as well as 2 of every animal in the world, managed to survive this event, and then they went on to restart the human race entirely on their own. Now, while the Bible only records one extinction-level flood event, several experts have also alluded to this as a possible reason why some of the sites we see today, including the Grand Canyon, are the way they are. In fact, Graham even goes on to expand on the theory, claiming that our world has actually been through several extinction-level floods that have acted as resets for it. In an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, Graham explained what he believed to be conclusive proof that there have been several pieces of evidence to show the existence of several flood events that have completely changed the way we view the planet. Graham even goes further, ascertaining that there must have been a flood so massive that it must have washed over the entire earth, essentially wiping the slate clean, just like it was recorded in the Bible. In fact, he even believes that the ancient flood must have been the reason for the destruction of Atlantis. Now, you might think Atlantis is no more than a myth or something, but researchers like Graham actually believe that it indeed existed. In a separate episode of Joe Rogan's podcast, Graham went deep into the topic of Atlantis, explaining that there's indeed historical evidence of this civilization existing. Graham began this by sharing his theory that the current melting of the ice caps must have been what started the same great floods that washed over the entire planet.
It's an incredibly important date because the Younger Dryas begins 12,800 years ago with a cataclysm, with a puzzling, mysterious rise in sea level at the same point, 1,000 years of freezing temperatures, mass extinctions of animal species all over the world, and then 11,600 years ago, global temperature shoots up. The last of the ice caps collapse into the sea. Sea level rises enormously. That is the date that work starts at Göbekli Tepe, and it's a point I've made many times, but it's really worth making because archaeologists roll their eyes every time you say the word Atlantis.
From there, Graham went on to discuss his theory about the origins of Atlantis. He drew from the works of Plato, the famous Greek philosopher who described Atlantis as a Western naval-style empire that ruled across most parts of the known world. However, like many prominent civilizations, the people of Atlantis soon began to exhibit dangerous levels of hubris and arrogance, so much so that they failed to see the trajectory of the world, and when a cataclysmic event eventually occurred, they were completely caught unaware. Most people believe that the story was no more than just an analogy written by Plato to decry the effects of arrogance, especially in this scale. However, there have recently been signs to point to the fact that this civilization did indeed exist, and that the consequences of their hubris were as real as day. From Graham's point of view, this cataclysmic event must have been the same floods everyone's been talking about. To further illustrate his point, Graham shares some insights about Plato's work that references Atlantis and explains that it just might have been based on a real civilization that actually existed.
If we look at the myths, the story of Atlantis is not alone. There are thousands of traditions from all around the world speaking of a global flood that destroyed a former civilization, that brought to an end a golden age.
Graham goes further once more, claiming that the story of Atlantis isn't an outlier. In fact, it's just one of the many stories that reference a massive flood on a global scale, one that ended up affecting the development of the world and causing a massive do-over. So how does this all tie into the Grand Canyon? Well, it's really simple. If the world actually did have a massive cataclysmic flood that changed landscapes, then it shouldn't be too far-fetched to believe that the current landscape of the Grand Canyon, complete with the Great Unconformity, could have been as a result of the flood's effects as well. Interestingly, this isn't the only thing about the Grand Canyon that has baffled Graham, as well as the entire world. As we're now aware, much of Graham's career has been focused on uncovering the truth about ancient civilizations that have existed and gone extinct long before humans even arrived on the scene. Well, as it turns out, Graham also believes strongly that the Grand Canyon could have been the base of settlement for one of these ancient, advanced civilizations. To come to this conclusion, Graham studied the works of several people who, like him, have also gone to the site of the Grand Canyon to explore and understand it. One such man was John Wesley Powell, an American geologist and Army official who led the first government-sponsored expedition of the Grand Canyon. Powell's expedition came in 1869, when he spent 3 months conducting a trip down the Green and Colorado rivers. This occurred after he had been appointed by then U.S. President James A. Garfield to serve as the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey. He gathered 10 men, 4 boats, and enough food to last for 10 months, moving from Green River in Wyoming through different rapids all the way to the river's confluence with the Colorado River. Of course, this was at a point when the Grand Canyon hadn't become as notable as the national park it is today. People didn't care much about it at the time, but Powell was intrigued by the strange rocks in the area. So he and his crew set up a base around from which they explored the Grand Canyon. They focused on analyzing the entire region, from its highlands and rivers to the pastures and much more. Powell was looking to draw a map of the Grand Canyon and learn its history. And even though there wasn't much by way of tools and technology, he still made some rather intriguing discoveries. For one, Powell found that the hard rocks in most of the canyon had gotten their shapes due to their interactions with water, particularly from the Colorado River. At the same time, he also hypothesized that these rocks contained materials that could point to the canyon's past and its origins. For years, Powell's discoveries encouraged and inspired more people to get interested in the Grand Canyon and its possible origins. And this inspiration was what led another man, G.E. Kincaid, to go on his own expedition. Not much is known about Kincaid before he became affiliated with the Grand Canyon. However, the moment his name became linked with the monument, the entire country was put on notice. In 1908, Kincaid set his sights on the Grand Canyon. He had heard about the monument through Powell's works, and he was looking to also see what it was about. Plus, this was a period when many believed President Theodore Roosevelt was planning to restrict the canyon from loggers and hunters, so Kincaid knew he had to move quickly. He took a boat and traveled down the Colorado River, entering the Grand Canyon. However, while Kincaid went into this place in search of adventure and a little loot, he ended up coming out with much more than he bargained for. About 40 miles upstream, Kincaid noticed rock formations with several strange markings. He was immediately interested, and even though there were no clear footpaths, he decided to follow the markings in hopes of possibly seeing where they originated from. A little while later, he noticed sandstones with steps carved into them, kind of like a staircase. The structure seemed like it was made by a human, something which piqued Kincaid's curiosity even more. At this point, Kincaid knew he was onto something big, so he pressed on as he believed he was about to hit a big score no matter what it was. When he got to the end of the steps, he came upon what he described as a hidden passage. On the walls, Kincaid found strange symbols and hieroglyphics. These symbols were nothing like he had ever encountered before, but they meant one thing, that humans had indeed visited this place before. Moving deeper into the tunnels, Kincaid found more of these strange drawings and carvings. He also saw side passages that led to different rooms with doorways. There were side spaces suggesting that whoever built the rooms had intended for there to be enough ventilation. Kincaid kept seeing these strange drawings and writings on the walls and immediately posited that the tribe or civilization that lived here must have been very ancient. However, considering just how impressive the architecture and engineering of the walls were, he could easily see that these people must have had some advanced knowledge. At this point, you can imagine that Kincaid's mind had run very wild. He was looking to discover the tribe that had lived here, and at the same time, he asked himself how they managed to build these structures. To add to this, Kincaid was also said to have found items such as residues of primitive weapons, a sculpted idol, and several reflective stones. All of these only strengthened his belief that a tribe or civilization must have lived in this region. The only question now was to find clues as to who they were and what might have happened to them. Did the oldest Americans settle in the Grand Canyon? When Kincaid came out with his discovery, he was derided by just about everyone. He was called a crackpot who was simply looking for attention. And even to date, there are those within the scientific community who dispute the things he found. However, recent discoveries have shown that he was indeed right. For one, sources claim that there are at least 1,000 caves within the bowels of the Grand Canyon, and so far, only a few hundred of them have really been explored. Together, the caves in the Grand Canyon constitute the largest cavern system in the United States, and the third largest in the entire world. Experts who've tried to date the caves have claimed that their formation began almost 350 million years ago, when the entirety of the southwestern United States was covered in the waters of an ancient sea. Over time, the bottom of the sea became layered, with the remains and shells of dead sea creatures helping to create a mud ooze rich in lime deposits. Eventually, the composite dried, forming the limestone bedrock that would go on to become the base of the caverns. A few million years later, natural disasters such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions helped to push the limestone bedrock a few hundred feet below the outer crust. These changes caused the earth to split, creating fissures and cracks that allowed massive rains to slip through. As more time went on, the introduction of acidic rain led to the creation of a solution that removed a little of the softer limestone layers. This created passageways and cavities, which would be filled with water, thus causing them to widen. Other effects of climate change brought less rain, so the water table in the region was lowered, enough to make the caverns appear above the table, and when their chambers eventually dried up, they got exposed. Over the course of the next few million years, the chambers dried up, exposing elaborate calcium carbonate deposits that eventually led to the formations that we now see in the caverns. Nevertheless, it's a popular belief that there could still have been human activity around this region that helped to catalyze the effects of nature. experts have been exploring the possibility of humans actually existing in the United States at least a few 100,000 years ago. And if that's the case, it could very well mean that they also settled in the Grand Canyon. Graham himself has espoused the theory that humans existed in the United States long before we are made to believe. In one of his presentations, he challenged the conventional belief in the Clovis culture theory, which states that the earliest signs of human activity in the Americas were recorded about 13,000 years ago.
The Cerruti Mastodon site is another extraordinary site. My God, I mean, those Clovis police are saying humans were only in America for 13,000 years ago. Here's a site that shows humans were in America 130,000 years ago, 10 times as long.
Once again, this was a notion that got a lot of pushback from many in the scientific community. Nevertheless, it hasn't stopped Graham from maintaining his stance that humans were indeed living in the United States for much longer than most of us might be willing to accept. In another episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, Graham reiterated his criticism of the Clovis culture theory, pointing out what he believed to be conclusive flaws in it.
I have to say, archaeologists like to insult me by calling me a pseudoscientist. I can't think of anything more pseudoscientific than the Clovis First doctrine, which locked American archaeology for 50 years in a particular framework which we now know was totally wrong. Nothing good about it at all. A complete mistake. The recent history of the Americas has been relatively well studied, but the deep and ancient history has not been well studied. And I think America is going to contain revelations for us about our story and about our past. And I'm serious when I suggest that America is the most plausible and the most likely home base.
Graham went on to share his theory about a lost civilization being in America, pointing out that any civilization that inhabited the Earth must have had their base on a very large mass of land, not just some small island that wouldn't have been able to support them. He also added that despite ticking all these boxes, historians and anthropologists have generally left out the United States when considering the history of the world and early settlements. However, with experts now discovering what appeared to have been ancient Egyptian drawings in Alabama, this might be a good time to rethink what we know.
We should find what is essentially the ancient Egyptian religion manifesting in the symbolism of Moundville, the ascent to Orion, the transit to the Milky Way, the journey along the Milky Way. These are very specific and idiosyncratic ideas. And what makes it doubly odd is Moundville isn't that old. Moundville, as a site, is about 1,000 years old.
At the end of the day, this isn't an outlandish thing to believe, and if
ancient Egypt had already been gone completely from the world for at least 600 years before Moundville was created. The end of ancient Egypt, there's Moundville. And what we're looking at in the foreground is Mound B, and we're looking at Mound A in the distance.
There truly were humans in the United States back in ancient times,
and a complete circle of mounds. What is odd about it is we find this system of ancient Egyptian ideas in Moundville 500 years after ancient Egypt has gone from the world. The Romans were the end of ancient Egypt. By 400 AD, ancient Egypt is gone. Moundville doesn't even exist then, but 600 years later, it is created and it manifests the entire set of ancient Egyptian ideas. Clearly, it did not get that as a result of direct transmission from ancient Egypt, unless they were time travelers. The only way I think it could have got it is as a result of a legacy passed down from a much earlier civilization that had influenced and affected many different parts of the world. And the characteristics of that civilization, the shamanistic heart of it, the use of altered states of consciousness, the focus on those,
then there really isn't any reason why these humans
are amongst the reasons that I would suggest that America is the place that we should be looking. And the big mysteries are in the areas that were so devastated at the end of the last ice age, up in the north of North America, the channeled scablands in particular, and then the Mississippi Valley, the whole story of the Mississippi Valley. Yes, Moundville is 1,000 years old, but then you can go back to Poverty Point in Louisiana, which is 2,700 years old. You can go to Watson Brake in Louisiana, which is 5,500 years old. You can go to sites like Conley, which are 8,000 years old. The system keeps on going back and
couldn't have settled in the Grand Canyon as well. The Grand Canyon is one of the most majestic sites in the United States. Coincidentally, this means that it's also one of the most mysterious. And while there's much we still don't know about it, the work of experts like Graham Hancock will be critical in helping lift the veil from our eyes. What do you think though? Could there be more about the Grand Canyon that we're missing? Let us know in the comments.